Nancy.
Okay, great. So I think we might as well start. So welcome everybody, and this is actually the fourth of the events in our Scholars Forum in the Catholic Intellectual Tradition series. This series developed because several of us became aware that a number of our faculty have books recently published or being published this year. Therefore, the Corps, partnering with the program and the Center of Catholic Studies, the Department of Religion, and Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, is excited to offer these glimpses into some of our wonderful faculty scholarship. And I should have said this, but I'm Nancy Enright, Director of the University Corps. I know most of you, but just in case any of you don't know me. Dr. Manning, who has collaborated with the Corps on such mutual events as the Conference on Nonviolence held during the fall of 2019, will be presenting on his new book, Converting the Imagination, Teaching for Recovering Jesus' Vision for Fullness of Life. Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan said, "A university is a reproductive organ of cultural community. Its constitutive endowment lies not in buildings or equipment, civil status or revenues, but in the intellectual life of its professors. Its central function is the communication of intellectual development." With that in mind, I am so pleased that Dr. Manning, who is an assistant professor in Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology, is presenting tonight. And before we turn to Dr. Anthony Shiglitano to do the introduction, I wanted to mention that Dr. Todd Stockdale will handle our Q&A at the end of the talk. And I now turn it over to Dr. Shiglitano.
Thanks so much, Nancy, and it's good to see all these familiar faces, many of which I don't see all that often anymore, because we're confined to this disincarnate existence at this point. But it's great to be with you, and it really makes me happy to introduce Dr. Manning or Patrick or Pat, whatever. I don't know how formal we're being at this point. It always seems difficult on these things. In any event, in 2004, John Cavadini at Notre Dame published a little article in Commonweal magazine, and it was called Ignorant Catholics. And it was, to me, it was a wake-up call, and I think it was almost a sort of clarion call. And in that article, it contained basically a lament and a manifesto. And the lament was that Catholics who came to Notre Dame, and he's quite humorous about some of the examples, are absolutely hilarious, but came to Notre Dame knowing pretty much nothing about their faith, and not some of the more technical details, but we're talking about how many gospels are in the New Testament, things along those lines, and I'm sure we've all encountered that. But it was also a lament that for a long time theologians thought that catechesis, or engaging with the church in very concrete ways, had become something of a step down, something beneath their occupation and their higher vocation to the academy. And then a call to renewed pedagogy, he called it, not simply doing things in some way that they were in the 1950s just because it seemed to work then, but actually a renewal of the way the faith is taught, to connect sort of with the contemporary world, to connect the contemporary world to the study of theology and training for Catholics. And so it's a great privilege of mine to introduce Pat, because I think that article really gets at the sort of things that, from what I can gather, he puts into practice on a regular basis, and does so in his new book, Converting the Imagination. Pat studied at Notre Dame. He did a BA, but he also did a master's, not only in theology, but also another master's in education, because who can rest with one master's? And so he did two instead, but bringing together education and theology. And it's pretty clear that education and pedagogy is absolutely essential to his whole sort of vocation, if I can speak so boldly for him without consulting him. But in any event, it seems to me that that's pretty obviously the case. And that vocation, as he describes it in different places, has to do with connecting not only the training of priests, right, the training of people who are going to be in pastoral ministry in our churches, theologically, enthusiastically, but also reaching out and getting them to be involved and aware of the different things for the different engagements in our world, right? And issues of poverty, issues of homelessness, issues of peace and nonviolence that he is concerned about and committed to. So I'm thrilled. He did his PhD at some school up north. I don't remember the name. It's in a major city on the eastern seaboard. In any event, I think it's above Connecticut and below Maine. That's all I know. But it's supposed to be a good school. He also teaches in the core. He teaches young people. I've actually witnessed him teaching. His teaching is outstanding. And in fact, I can testify to how important Patrick is to me because I am teaching a course in Christian anthropology right now, entirely from a syllabus that he developed, which is an absolutely brilliant syllabus. It is all Lonergan and Rahner, by the way. I'm a Balthasar scholar. To some of you, that may not mean anything, but for those of you in theology, you know my soul is bleeding out at this point from teaching so much Lonergan and Rahner. But it's a absolutely terrific syllabus. The students love it, and it's worked out brilliantly because it brings to bear the gifts that I think Patrick brings, and is going to bring in this new book, Converting the Imagination, and that is this ability to connect deep theological thought with the needs of our contemporary landscape. And a few articles, I'll just mention, there's a number of them, but I'll just mention three that may whet your appetite for Patrick Manning's work. So disintegrating worldviews, this is what I mean, creating meaning, right? Disintegrating worldviews and the future of Catholic education, addressing the deep roots of Catholic disaffiliation or Catholic stepping back from things, right? Catholic education. Teaching for the Recovery of Meaning, very much linked with the current book, an imagination-centered pedagogical approach for today's college students, engaging our symbols, sharing our world, forming young people around symbols for participation in the public sphere, also in religious education. So there's a vocation here, not just a book. And the vocation, of course, has to do with conversion. In this case, it seems to me, I have not read the book yet, but it seems to me it has to do with converting the imagination to find meaning in the world through faith and to engage faith with contemporary issues. And with that, I'm thrilled to listen to and hear from Dr. Manning. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. That was really generous, and I hope I can live up to that. Although I got to say, I started to sweat when you started your introduction talking about ignorant Catholics. So I'm glad you shifted course eventually there. So thanks to Tony. Thank you to the Core Catholic Studies and the seminary for hosting these conversations and for the invitation to be a part of it. I'm really grateful to be here to share about some of my work and to have a conversation. So what I'd like to do is I'll proceed basically in three parts. I want to kind of set up what I've done in my project is just to talk about some of the challenges of the world that we live in today. I'll then talk about how I see that affecting individuals, and then finally kind of moving into what might be the role of Catholic education. And this is where I'm making the most constructive suggestions in terms of my own work and my own pedagogy. So to begin with the sort of the promise, but also some of the challenges of postmodern life. So Jesus says in the 10th chapter of the Gospel of John, "I have come that they might have life and have it in abundance." And that's a really enticing promise, right? This is what we all want, is a meaning, rather a life full of meaning, of purpose and happiness. This is what Jesus says he comes to offer, and this is what Christianity has sort of held out to people for the past two millennia. And yet, as a teacher in Catholic schools, high schools, and universities, Tony is absolutely right that I consider education. Increasingly, it's been my experience that my students do not seem to be realizing this sort of vision or promise for fullness of life. Very often, and again, Tony's comments quoting John Cavadini about the sort of a lack of understanding of even Catholic students, they're not finding this meaning and purpose within the Christian tradition. But perhaps even more alarming is that there are a lot of young people in particular who don't seem to be finding much meaning anywhere. I always think about one of my students who I taught at that certain school up north, who he was a really bright kid, very social, athletic, involved in a ton of clubs, came from a well-connected family. I just had a very, very bright and promising future. And yet it became clear to me, or rather I learned as the semester went on, that at some point he had slid into a rather serious depression. And as I talked with him about this, he explained that, in spite of all these good things going on, he really just at that point didn't see much meaning or purpose to his life. And sadly, this is not an isolated incident. A study that recently came out found that 1 in 4 young people, so people between the age of 13 and 24, 1 in 4 say that they rarely or never experience a sense of meaning or purpose in life. That's a quarter of our young people. Think of a quarter of our students here at the university. And I just find that terribly alarming. I think this has everything to do with the sort of rise in anxiety and the decline in mental health in our country, especially among young people today. And I think this is something that our popes have recognized. Pope Francis just last year said in a papal audience, "Today's serious threat is the loss of meaning in life." So this is what I really see is, even beyond this current health pandemic, I think there's this wider crisis of meaning affecting our society. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand, what's happening here, what is going on with our students. One person who's been really helpful to me is Robert Keegan, who is a psychologist emeritus up at Harvard University, another one of those universities up north. And he makes an argument that life in the modern world makes more mental demands upon us than most of us are equipped to handle. The title of one of his books is "In Over Our Heads." And so he talks about things like, if you think about the way that people have to navigate their relationships, a career, but also sort of putting together, constructing a sense of identity in a way that people didn't have to do in the past. Plus living in an era marked by radical pluralism, where we're constantly encountering people from different perspectives, cultures, religious backgrounds, and worldviews that challenge our own. And then on top of this, we live in this time where we're just flooded, bombarded with information and images and messages through our smartphones and computers. And all this happening in a society that's marked by a very rapid rate of change. So Keegan's point is that this is a lot for any of us to juggle as we're trying to make sense of the world that we live in, as we're trying to make sense of ourselves and our lives. And modern people are perhaps particularly poorly equipped to deal with this, because at the same time we've seen a sort of disintegration of the frameworks of meaning that gave meaning to people's lives really up until very recent history. The sociologist Peter Berger talks about religion as historically really the main source of meaning for people's lives. It's something that could virtually be taken for granted in just about any civilization, any era in history up to the present. but in recent history, we've seen a sort of secularization. And I think Charles Taylor's work on this is really helpful in understanding secularization is not just a decline in religion, but he talks about a sort of supernova effect. That there has been a weakening or a fragmentation of a Christian imaginary or worldview, but at the same time, all these alternatives have come in. People have now you can be Christian or Jewish or a humanist or an agnostic. But the effect that this has is that almost never is meaning a given anymore. We see all of these alternatives presented to us in terms of understanding the world and life. So there's no default. There's no given. And all of these positions are fragilized, Taylor would say. As I think about this as a Christian educator, I do think that the church is somewhat at fault or somewhat remiss in the midst of all this, in the sense that the church has not always adapted adequately to the changing times. We have not, and I think John Cavadini is one pointing to the need to adapt, but we have not always done this quickly enough, recognizing the struggles that people are encountering and adjusting the way that we hand on the faith so that people are equipped with this. I think one of those oversights is a failure to recognize and treat people as meaning makers, as beings who have to construct a meaning for their lives. So where all this leads for me is I've come to land on this, what I see as a primary task for education in this current era, and that is supporting people in developing habits of meaning making that they need to live full lives, to lead faithful lives in the postmodern world. And so that's sort of the setup. That's the challenge that I try to respond to in this book. Okay, so if those are the challenges that we are confronted with, then this raises the question, well, what kind of meaning making would be adequate to the postmodern world? If, as Keegan says, we're all in over our heads, what would help us to get our heads above water? So I go into a lot more detail in the book, but I'll give sort of 3 examples of what this kind of meaning making might look like, and relate these to some features of society as we experience it today. So one important feature of modern culture is that it's a very critical culture. So we are living with the legacy of the Enlightenment, which of course brought critiques of religion, but also sort of an elevation of human reason. Not taking anything dogmatically, but rather trying to be able to justify everything, to find reasons for it. We live in a time that's marked by widespread positivism, an attitude that if it can't be seen, tested, quantified, then it is not real. It's also an era in which we see widespread suspicion of institutions and authorities. The polls have been tracking this in recent decades, and we've seen a steady decline in people's confidence in all sorts of religious institutions, or rather institutions in general, but including religious institutions and churches. So living in this critical culture, although there have been gains from this, it also has a negative effect that it has really emptied the meaning out of a lot of our traditions, a lot of those traditional sources of meaning that people used to draw upon. So where does that leave us today? Well, today, in order to make sense of the world that we live in, we need what I would call a sort of post-critical recovery of things like symbol, ritual, story, embodied and contemplative modes of knowing. So these are all traditional sources of meaning that have sort of come under fire, that have been critiqued by Enlightenment thinkers, by scientifically minded people who are wary of superstition, of things that can't be quantified, that aren't empirical. But what people are realizing in the current era is that that kind of critique, it's helpful in some ways, but it doesn't give much meaning to life. And that is embodied in imaginative human beings, we really need these sources of meaning. And so the answer is not to go back to a sort of a naive era in which we just dwell in superstition, but that would occur would call a second day. So bringing those sort of gifts and strengths of critical consciousness to these elements of religion, like symbol and ritual, not falling into that superstition, being aware of those dangers, but also recognizing our need for these things and the meaning that they can give to life. So this would be one feature of a kind of meaning making that we need today. Another feature of the society we live in today that I've already alluded to is the sort of breakdown in a Christian worldview, which is concurrent with a breakdown in community in our society. So the result of this, as I was saying before, is we really can't take much as a given anymore. We don't just inherit meaning, or we don't inherit our identity in the way that people did in previous eras. At the same time, we just have many fewer supports and structures to support us than we did in the past. Peter Savastano spoke earlier in this series about his book on Thomas Merton. Merton, in his very last paper that he ever gave, offered this famous line that from now on, everyone stands on their own 2 feet. And I think that's very apt in thinking about where we are today. That there are just so many fewer supports in terms of the religious support. The community is not there to just carry us along anymore. Everyone must stand on their own 2 feet. And what I mean by this in terms of meaning making is that we live in a time when people, first of all, have to be self-aware of themselves as meaning makers, to recognize that meaning is not something that is simply given, that can't be just assumed, but it's really something that we must construct. And at the same time, I would say that going beyond that, we need to be not only self-aware, but we need to exercise what some researchers and educators would refer to as self-authorship, to sort of intentionally take up this work of constructing meaning for our lives. For the Lonerganians in the crowd, Tony, plug your ears. I don't want to give you any more of a headache. This is, the sort of thing that Lonergan is thinking about when he's talking about self-appropriation, recognizing how we know, how we make meaning, and really taking on that work in a very deliberate fashion. So a third and final feature of society that we live in today, again, is the sort of rapidly changing context and this information overload that we all suffer from in an era of smartphones and the internet. So living in a time when we are constantly bombarded by so much information, where so much is changing, it's simply not enough to hand on a static body of doctrine or beliefs to people, because those set of beliefs, that worldview, is going to be challenged on virtually a daily basis in the world today. So what we need, even on that, is we need to be able to be active imaginers. We need to have an active imagination. In other words, we need to be involved in this ongoing work of creating a worldview, constructing a worldview, and sort of recreating that and refashioning that as it is challenged by the world that we live in. So to give an image, we could think about, not so much when we hand on a tradition or hand on the faith, not sort of building a house for people to live in, but training the builders, training them to be building that home for themselves, and to continue work on it when the storms of postmodernity do some damage. So these are just sort of 3 features of the kind of meaning making that I think would be more adequate to the world that we live in today. And I tend to sum this all up with this phrase of a post-critical meaning making, or a post-critical faith. So it brings those skills or gifts of critical consciousness, but recognizing this deep human need for meaning and for the things that give meaning, like symbol and ritual, and I would say spirituality. Okay, so this I would offer is the kind of meaning making that's needed for today. And the last place I want to go is to talk about how Christian communities and institutions can support people in making meaning in this kind of way. So a couple of things just briefly. One I think that what we need desperately today are communities that serve as what a psychologist named Winnicott would call holding environments, or what Pope Francis might call communities of accompaniment. We need communities where people are able to be in transition, when people are able to sort of work through their questions and their difficulties. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of those. At least this is my impression, and this would be verified in some studies that have been done. There's a somewhat well-known study done a number of years back called "Going, Going, Gone" about young people who have left the Catholic Church. And one of the themes that came up in that study was that very often young people's questions were not being answered. They had very serious questions about their faith tradition, about life, and they weren't finding good answers. They weren't receiving good answers from the authority figures. Very often their questions were simply dismissed or ignored. And that simply is insufficient in today, because people have questions. They are struggling through this, and we need to create places where people can work through those questions and support each other in that transition. Another thing that I think would be really important for our communities today is encouraging the vocation of artists and engaging with art, literature, film, these sorts of things. And I think this is important because I believe that it really is first and foremost our artists. It is art that forms our worldviews. I think that, as important as philosophy and theology and those sort of things are, I think they're secondary because it's when we inherit these kind of images and stories from our artists and authors, those are the things that create a world for us to dwell in. So those are a couple of brief suggestions, but what my book is mostly about, and what I want to spend the rest of the time on, is talking about Catholic education and the role that that can play in supporting people in making meaning today. So as I said, I think one of the ways that Catholic education has fallen down in recent time is that we have not recognized sufficiently that people are meaning makers. People are not passive receptacles for information, and if we really hope to be passing on something that is living and meaningful for people, we need to recognize that people are actively doing this work of making meaning, and we need to support them in that. So first step towards that is understanding how, as human beings, we construct meaning. I think something that's crucial about this that I've already hinted at is that meaning making is primarily the work of the imagination. So again, for the Lonerganians, think about Lonergan saying that that the image leads to the insight, or the insight comes out of the image. Or again, for Recur fans out there, he says that it is the symbol that gives rise to thought. So just in terms of how human cognition works, it's really through our experiences that we form mental images. And these are sort of the basic building blocks of thought and meaning for us, are these mental images. It's upon that foundation of those mental images that we begin to form concepts, that we're able to reason, but we need that foundation. And on the other hand, when it comes to actually living, to envisioning a life for ourselves, we need to have some kind of vision. We don't act in a meaningful sort of way without a vision of what we are going to do. And so it's problematic if education is only operating on this level of abstraction, of concepts, of reasoning. That's important. I don't want to dismiss that. But if we're going to do this harder work of helping people to construct meaning for their lives, we need to get down to a deeper level, to that level of the imagination, where people are forming those mental images, because that's where deep meaning is generated. Ed Foley talks about deep symbols. Sandra Schneider talks about master images that guide our lives. We can talk about sort of master narratives. Those are productions of the imagination, and that's where education needs to work if we're really going to help people to live meaningful lives. So, having dug into the research in this and always trying to be a better teacher myself, Over the years, including the time I've been teaching in the core, I've sort of worked out this pedagogical approach that I find to be very helpful to students in being able to construct more meaning for their lives. So I use this acronym of C to sort of guide me in this. So, recognizing that people are trying to form some kind of vision for their life. I like the visual metaphor. But these three letters, SEE, stand for these three movements of stimulating the imagination, expanding the imagination, and embracing new ways of imagining. So right now, I put a link into the post to a website or to a web page that sort of lays out these three steps. So people are welcome to follow along there as I'm talking through these. All right, so these three steps. The first is stimulating the imagination. You can't shape clay that's already been set. And the same, to a certain extent, is true for human minds, human imaginations. That for meaning to be generated, the mind needs to be active. The imagination needs to be stimulated. Often it is some kind of direct personal experience that does that. And so things like service learning are incredibly beneficial in this regard. Also, we have people here like Juan Rios at Seton Hall who are doing work with virtual reality, which I think has a lot of potential here as well. But even more simply, as teachers, we can just raise questions that dig into students' experiences, about what they're experiencing in life, about assumptions they might bring to the classroom, about their mental images. But the idea here is just to get the wheels turning. Unless their minds are active, unless they're digging into their own experiences and images, it's really hard to generate anything meaningful without that first happening. So this is this first step, is stimulating the imagination. The second is expanding the imagination. So I think what we've seen in a modern era is a lot of people have rejected these barriers of meaning that we inherited from religious traditions, is that it's hard to create meaning ex nihilo. In fact, I think it's impossible, that we never just construct a meaning out of thin air. We're always borrowing from the stories and symbols and rituals of the culture and the traditions in which we're embedded. And so I think it's helpful to pay attention to this in the way that we teach, that in order to construct meaning, we need to encounter something that is meaningful, something that helps us to make sense where we couldn't make sense of things before. And so this is why I think things like a core curriculum are so important, where students come into contact with classic texts, texts that are classic in the sense that David Tracy would explain. We recognize that something of momentous importance is here. That's something that could potentially affect my life. So these kind of texts, but also Christian art and music, stories, rituals, practices, and also the people who we encounter, who we sense that that this person is more alive. There is wisdom in this person. We need to have these kind of encounters in order to borrow that meaning that we can begin to build upon. But sometimes our inadequate meanings also have to be disrupted or challenged. So if you think, I mentioned positivism earlier. St. Augustine is someone who fell to this earlier in life, that he couldn't think of God or anything else in existence except for in material terms. But he eventually realized that that was inadequate, that reality was larger than what he could touch and see. We might also think about some of the racial biases that we sometimes bring to the classroom and bring to our lives. These are inadequate meanings that need to be disrupted in order for a more adequate meaning to be constructed. So finally, the second E is embracing new ways of imagining. Nothing becomes meaningful for us unless we own it, unless we make it our own. So, even if we are exposed to the meanings of others, we need to synthesize this for ourselves. We need to integrate this with what we already believe, with our existing master images. And this involves doing the work of making personal judgments about, this is what Jesus says leads to fullness of life. Do I think this is true? Is this true in my own experience? So making a personal judgment and also ultimately a decision to act upon what I am recognizing as meaningful. This involves envisioning a way forward and actually acting upon that. So, so this is what my research and my teaching have led me to recognize, that that these are three really crucial moments in the way that we construct meaning for our lives. And in order to really be of help to especially our young people today, educators need to be more intentional about guiding learners through these movements, of doing this work in a more intentional and deliberate manner. One thing I point out in my book is that actually, even though Jesus didn't have the benefit of all this modern cognitive science, we see him going through just these kind of movements, especially in the way that he told stories, that he told parables. And I found this to be very effective in my own teaching. So again, there's a lot more details and examples in the book. There are some things in the website that I shared in the chat. But these three movements I see as being really important. So thinking about our setting here at Seton Hall, I think the courses that we teach in the core, but also in religion, in Catholic studies, theology, philosophy, these are really ideal opportunities to dig into this work of meaning making and to support students in that. But I wouldn't limit it to those kind of classes. I think there are many opportunities in a university setting. And that might be something that would be interesting for us to talk about in the Q&A. What might be the possibilities at a place like Seton Hall? So, so let me just summarize and wrap up, because I'm tired of hearing myself talk. So the postmodern world makes it hard for us to make sense of life. There are just so many challenges. There's so much thrown at us. It's more than most of us are really equipped to handle at present. And this has huge consequences. I think this contributes to the reason to people disaffiliating, to leaving behind old religious traditions, because they're not finding meaning there. And I think this is a big contributing factor to the decline in mental health that we've been seeing in the past decade or so. So for me, this really raises up a crucial task of education, including religious education, theological education. We need to help learners to develop these kind of habits of post-critical meaning making that will enable them to realize that promise that Jesus offered of fullness of life. So I've written this book, and I hope it provides a hopeful model for this, or at least a starting point for a conversation about how we can do better for our students. So with that, I will wrap up and be very happy to talk with people about your ideas and hear people's questions.
Hey, well, thank you, Pat. I really appreciate that presentation. Certainly stimulating. The subject matter was indeed timely. And I like your invitation to consider the possibilities of what this might look like here at Seton Hall. That's certainly where my thoughts went during your presentation, so thank you for that. The way this will work is we have about 20 minutes together here with Pat to be able to have a conversation extended with him. If you'd like to engage in the conversation, just, of course, raise your hand, as our students now have learned to do. And I already see Ksenia's hand up. And I'll just invite you to engage with Pat in the conversation. But if you'd also like to post a question or a comment in the chat, I'll be monitoring that as well for us, and we'll bring those questions to Pat through the chat feature as well. So, Ksenia, I'll invite you to ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Do you hear me? Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm breaking the ice, right? Okay, so I was thinking about those mental images you mentioned, that they're the foundation of meaning making.
Mm-hmm.
So what I was thinking is mental image is a mental representation of something,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if your meaning making is rooted in a mental representation, then how do you explain its relation to reality, right? Because we want this meaning discovering also to take a place in meaning making. So what would be the connection to reality in that? So I just want to contrast your model to the sort of contemplative model, where it's important to be here and now in the present, and actually sometimes mental images of ourselves can be an obstacle to really knowing ourselves, who we truly are, right? Because the ego creates a story about who I am, what is my vocation, and so on. So I was wondering, how do you incorporate that part into your meaning making and the more religious attitude of listening, right? It's important to listen to what is God calling me to be. So maybe I'm supposed to be a teacher, so I go to teach the university, well, this is what I'm doing. But maybe I need also imagination to understand what a teacher really means. And can I be a teacher outside of that, right? Can maybe I'm called to do something that is outside of those parameters. So when I think about meaning making or meaning discovering, however you want to call it, and students, I always think that imagination is kind of necessary to open up those categories for us. What does it mean to be a teacher? Maybe I can be it in a different way. So why would there be a single way of realizing that kind of vocation? And we tend to give kind of pre-packed answers to these questions. Oh, you'll be a teacher, or you'll be, I don't know, an artist or whatever. But what if God has something more there for us? Then we have to use imagination to reach that point. So how can we be better at letting students discover their path, giving them that space? That's something I asked myself, but I take the previous things there for you more. But you can answer this question too. I'm fine with that. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Ksenia. Yeah, what a wonderful couple of questions. There are multiple questions in there. So, first, as regards, it's interesting you bring up this sort of contemplative approach, because as I was wrapping up with this book, I was getting more deeply into contemplative pedagogy myself, and maybe I would be better served by just turning it over to Chad Thralls here. But I'll just share my own thoughts. I agree. I think I talked about sort of 3 habits of meaning making that I think are really important for the world today. But actually, another one that I talk about in the book that I think is really foundational is you use the word attention, and just being attentive. I think that is I think that's a huge challenge for young people who have been conditioned to have very short attention spans, and really want instant gratification. So I think simply attending and learning to dwell within a text, within image, is really important and really foundational in some ways. Something else that I go on. You made a comment about the connection between mental representations or images and reality, and I think that's really important. And so something that I go into greater detail with in the book is again, I must appease the Lonerganians in the room, recognizing the importance of judgment and decision. So as I pointed out, our mental images can be deformed. We can have a view of reality that is inadequate, or actually out of touch with reality. And so the role of judgment is really important, and I think that's part of the function that that doctrine and that religious traditions, but also encounters with others, can serve. Is it's not just sort of conjuring up our own vision of reality, but sort of testing that against a longer tradition, or testing that against the views of other people. So you asked another intriguing question about the sort of path that we lay out for our students, but I think I want to stop here just so we can let others into the conversation as well. But thank you, Ksenia.
Thank you, Ksenia, and thank you, Pat. Pat, we have a question from your colleague and dear friend, Gregory Floyd. Greg, I'd like to invite you to ask Pat your question.
Great job, Pat. This was a fantastic presentation. I feel like I learned a lot. I'm sorry the philosophers are piling on here as I follow Ksenia. I think what I want is a clarification that I think will lead sort of in some interesting directions. You talk about constructing meaning, which I think to non-Lonerganians and non-phenomenologists suggest a false dichotomy between meaning that's mind independent and out there, and meaning that's merely mind dependent and in here and therefore constructed. As you know, Lonergan talks about sort of constituent and incarnational forms of meaning, which I think gets closer at what you mean by constructive, which I agree is a simpler term. So I was hoping you could elaborate. By constructing meaning, you don't mean arbitrarily assigning ourselves a meaning to live by. I had the same word that Ksenia used. We also clearly discover meaning in things and practices and relationships that in that sense is already there and not dependent on us, although we could miss it. So I was hoping you could elaborate on exactly what you mean, or that process of constructing meaning as something that's not merely arbitrary and volitional, right? Merely a matter of me deciding what my meaning is, and yet does involve a concerted effort on the part of the subject to discover and in some sense really to make meaning.
Right, and so this is why in the book I in this presentation, I did use this language of meaning making because I think that's a little bit more common parlance. But I actually have a preference for the language of meaning construction because, at least for me, it has this connotation that, well, when we construct something, we're not fabricating it out of thin air. It implies that we have some kind of material that we're working with. So I would completely agree with the implication that, and this is why I made the point that we never create meaning ex nihilo, and I think this has been part of the struggle of living in the wake of the Enlightenment for all its gifts. We had these critiques of religion that really sort of evacuated religion and these bearers of meaning. So again, symbols, stories, sacred text. They were so thoroughly critiqued that a lot of people are ready to just throw them out. But again, we have someone like Ricoeur who would say it's the symbol that gives rise to thought. That we need these things. We need to discover certain things, as you say. And again, I think David Tracy's work is really helpful in this regard in talking about classics, that there are these certain text, events, persons in which we detect something really significant, something really meaningful for our lives. And so, right, we are never constructing, we're never making meaning, fabricating it out of thin air on our own. We're always borrowing some kind of material. And I would add that this is really a communal endeavor as well. And that to the extent that we are isolated or we are deprived of a community, our meaning making is really going to be impoverished as well.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. Pat, Dr. Shiglitano has a question for you, but I think before you answer it, you need to make him say the words Boston College. You at least need to have him say those words before you
I concur.
You control the mute, Todd, so you can hold him at bay until he does. Tony, please.
There we go. Boston College, wonderful, wonderful place. Rumors have it. Patrick, yeah, it's really wonderful, and congratulations on the book, first of all. But really wonderful presentation. And I thought, the Ricoeur, I like Ricoeur very, very much. There is an element of Ricoeur that is a kind of virtuoso element that and almost in some ways then could almost make things worse. And I think it comes from his sort of Calvinist humanism. He's a brilliant man who's read everything, right? And can construct whole worlds of meaning, it seems. And so I thought really you're and Lonergan, you can get that feeling, but I think in the end it's not the case. And there's a difference, and I think the difference is the emphasis you placed on community and these communities of friends who perhaps investigate meaning making themselves with one another through encounter, through mutual correction, et cetera, and how to develop those communities. Because otherwise there's a way in which Ricoeur as brilliant as he is with the second naivete, going through the critical moment to the construction moment, where you live in a world you can inhabit in meaning, the idea that the person is doing all of that probably requires you to be Paul Ricoeur. I mean, and so at that point, it becomes a really difficult thing. And so anyway, I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more about the importance of community with respect to this, because I think that's really crucial to this, and how to bring people into such communities, right?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Yeah, I think a really important issue. Right. So, so as I said, I early on I quoted Robert Keegan up at Harvard, and his claim that almost all of us are in over our heads. In other words, most of us are not Paul Ricoeurs. We're not able to quite cut it and make sense of life in the postmodern world. So where does that leave us? And so, I've tried to come at this issue from a few different angles. And what I focus on is the pedagogical, because I'm a teacher. My setting is in a university and, working in parishes and things like that. And I think this is one element of the response. And so I think one thing that our communities can be doing is to sort of, train our students up, train our young people up in these kind of habits of meaning making. So, this might be like the equivalent of kind of, throwing them a life vest, to help them to keep their heads above water. But as you say, obviously that's not the ideal, that it's sort of everyone fending for themselves. I just think that's sort of, a first response, to the situation. But really the ideal, would be a building stronger communities. So, I use this language of communities of accompaniment or holding environments. And, I think it's really interesting to actually look on sort of the margins of the church and beyond to see where these kinds of things are happening elsewhere. So these days there are now a number of online communities. There's a podcast in an online community called Nomad, and their tagline is something like looking for signs of hope in a post-Christian landscape. And basically what it is, it's this community of seekers who consider themselves to be no longer Christian or post-Christian, and they're trying to make sense of it together, but they're trying to do it together. And there are a number of podcasts and online communities and Facebook groups that are like this. And I think the church ought to be doing more of this kind of work, because I think a lot of times people have the feeling that if you don't state the party line, if you show signs of doubt, then you don't belong, and people don't feel comfortable there. And I think that's absolutely the opposite. Francis, I think, has been trying to combat that kind of mentality. We really need to be much more a community of welcome, a place that is tolerant of ambiguity, of people going through these kind of challenges, and being welcome, being willing, as Francis says, to accompany people, to sort of walk through them in the journey, even though it's probably going to be uncomfortable in the meantime.
Thanks, Pat. That's fantastic. Yeah, thanks. I have to go to a different meeting in a few minutes, so don't, sorry.
Thanks so much for being here, Tony. Really appreciate it.
Tony, please tell them where I am, because I'm going to see. Okay. I told Father Phil I'd be late.
Before we invite Monsignor Lydia and Anthony Hayner into the conversation, I do have a question from our chat, Pat. This comes from Chad Thralls. He says this. He says, I love the emphasis on meaning making. Let's get concrete. How do you approach texts in undergraduate courses with an overall interest in meaning making, as opposed to something like an overall interest in understanding the faith or understanding the text for its own sake?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last time I taught the Journey course, I really shifted the way I approached it to take more of this kind of approach. And what that meant for me is I just made the decision that I was willing to do less presentation of content, and I was willing I was wagering that it was going to be more worthwhile for students, that they would possibly come away from the course with less declarative knowledge, so they may not be able to say, well, Plato's beliefs are this, this, and this, and Jesus taught this, this, and this, but rather they had struggled with the text, and they had some sense of direction or some clearer vision for themselves of what their lives might mean. And so that meant that I sacrificed some lecture time, or actually what I did was I kind of pushed the lecture to recorded videos, so people could supplement what we were doing in the classroom. But I spent more time in class doing the sort of activities that I describe in the book, or that you can find on the website there. So doing things like just, spending time with students' questions and really drawing out those questions about, what's your life like right now? What are your struggles? What are your hopes? What does the good life look for you? And really spending time digging into those questions. It was interesting. And some of us were part of this CIT conference with Sacred Heart recently. And I was talking with Michelle Loris, and she said that they train their teachers in their core really to not lecture, but basically just to be facilitators of conversation, and really to just draw out these questions, and that's where they devote the vast majority of their energy. So I did more of that, but also, going back to what Ksenia was saying about contemplative methods, and Chad, I'm sure you'll eat this up. I decided I was more willing to give more time in class to sort of, slower activities. Even doing like a slow reading, an imaginative reading, even like a Lectio Divina style reading of these texts, where students could really sort of enter into it, put themselves into the scene, into the text, into the shoes of the author, and kind of feel that out for themselves, because that gives a really different quality to the learning, and it really gives them that space to kind of be constructing meaning themselves, rather than just kind of keeping everything at that higher conceptual level, where it's just sort of downloading declarative knowledge. So, Chad, I'd love to talk a lot more about that, but that's it in a gist.
Well, thank you, Pat, and I see Parker and Chad are also thankful for your response. And Pat, I can probably see a Journey Faculty Development Workshop developing out of this, and so be looking out for an email from me to maybe line that up. Monsignor Liddy, you have a question for Pat.
Well, it follows along with what it seems like everybody is talking more about, forming community, and as a way of developing the imaginations of students. And I was just reading something the other day about Ira Progoff on the journal keeping. And I know that in recent years teaching, I've had the students journal in class, even just to settle them down at the beginning of class, so that they get in touch with what's going on in them, and that they're more open to asking questions about what the next step is in their hearts and in their lives. So anyway, this is right from what Tony was asking before about community. I guess the question, is, and you basically were talking about it just now. In other words, how do you do this in your classes? And what are good practices that can help students, be in touch with themselves? And I've, at least journaling, I've found in recent years, even teaching the sort of abstract type things of Lonergan, that journaling is really, so anyway, I'm just pulling together, I think, what a lot of people have asked about here. How in fact do you do it? And I just heard you talking that way. So anyway.
So thanks, Monsignor. Thanks so much for coming. So I just posted in the chat a link to another page from my website. And so on this page, I actually lay out sort of, step by step, some of the different learning activities that you can use. So I'll highlight just a couple, but people can go and read more there. But I think journaling is great, and I think that's a great example of the sort of thing that I was talking about doing in that first movement, because that does exactly that work of getting students to dig into their own experiences, to sort of activate the imagination, to bring to mind those kind of mental images of what's been going on in their lives. It's sometimes it helps to prime the pump a little bit. And so one useful way of doing this is, just by showing videos, or I've come to use music a lot with my Journey students. There's another thing I've read in recent research on young people is how important music is. That this is really, they relate to it so much, and it's a sort of a way for them to express themselves. So so often at the beginning of the semester, when I'm learning about students, I'll ask them, well, what are you watching? What are you listening to? And then I'll try and bring some of that into the class, because if we listen to this song together, often that will raise up themes about suffering or identity or relationships. And that, I find, it really gets them talking much more quickly and in a much more animated way than if I just said, so what do you think about this, or what's on your mind about this topic. So just a couple of suggestions.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Monsignor Liddy. We have time for one more question, and it looks like, Anthony, you're a part of this conversation. You'd like to address the question to chat or to Pat, so I'll invite you to do that now.
Thank you, Todd. Yeah, I'll be brief. So, no, thanks for your presentation, Patrick, and congrats on the book. The book is on my Kindle, and I look forward to reading it as soon as possible. Right. So, but when I taught Core 1 and 2, I think one of the most difficult things to open students up to is this notion that we can discover or uncover transcendent truths that are not, to go back to Greg's point, that are not mind dependent. All right, so I think that was a real struggle. But once there is an openness to that, then it seems to me that then we shift to sort of meaning construction. How do we get students to see that they are like co-creators, that they are participating in and cooperating in that transcendent reality? All right, so and those transcendent truths, to help achieve them, realize them. So I know I've always been influenced by this notion of co-creation. So how important is that? How that concept? Where does that play or figure into your framework? So I guess
right, yeah. So this is very much in the thread of what Greg was talking about earlier. So actually, in the later in the book, this is the direction that I go in. When earlier on, I'm talking in terms that would probably be more acceptable to a more general or secular audience, in terms of this is the way that we construct meaning. But eventually, where I land myself is I say that we don't make or construct meaning on our own. We are co-creators of meaning, as you said yourself. So in terms of the practical question of how to sort of engage students with that, there's no guarantee. You can't force it. All you can do is sort of lead them to water. So again, David Tracy is someone who's been helpful to me in this. He talks about questions, or if you're more of a Charles Taylor fan, he talks about thin places. So those aspects of our experience, those moments of profound suffering, of encounters with death, which are not remote from our students right now. those are the kind of situations when we talk about those experiences, then I think there tends to be more of an openness to exploring these kind of issues. And so so maybe that opens them up. But then the question of, well, will they become co-creators? Will they be, will they cooperate in this, transcendent meaning? Again, what I try to do in my own teaching approach is to invite them to it, because again, you can't force it, you can't compel it. What you can do is, engage, for me, teaching in the core, engage them with these classic texts. And I think it's really helpful to present them as, these are written by people who were asking the same questions as you are. And this is where they have found meaning. This is where they found something that's life-giving for them. Why? And to bring that question to the text. What did they find here? And I think at least raising that question, it might entice at least a lot of our students. Never you're always going to have some who are just completely tuned out, but at least you can put that out there and extend the invitation.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks, Anthony. Nancy, your hand is up, and I want to just at this time actually thank Pat and then turn it over to you, Nancy, because if you have a question for Pat, I'll let you engage with him and then let you kind of close our time down together as well.
Yep, you're muted, Nancy.
Muted, Nancy.
I'm sorry, I always do that. Thank you, Pat. That was a fabulous presentation. And I did actually have a question, so I'll let my question lead into my closing it off, I guess. When I really appreciated what you were saying about literature and art. And when you were talking about the new naivete, I was thinking of the poems of William Blake. And how he has the Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, and then he has some poems that are called the poems of new innocence, and they they show an awareness of evil, but it's transcendent through redemption. And so I was just wondering if you could just speak very quickly, I know we're wrapping up our time, about the new naivete.
Sure. Right. So so the idea here is, it's interesting. We've had this interweaving of discussions of contemplative pedagogy here, but it's something you find in contemplative literature as well. This idea of a second naivete or a second innocence. And so, what this is it's something that can only be come by sort of passing through that critical phase or that dark night. It means coming to awareness of that meaning can be distorted, of recognizing that, if we're talking about religion can be corrupted. It can be confused with, superstition and fantasy. And it involves developing those critical capacities to make reasonable, to understand things well, to make reasonable judgments about, and to sort of separate out fact from fiction. But this is consistent in so many different fields and studies that there is a further movement beyond that critical movement. Because as I said earlier, that kind of critical reasoning, it doesn't give much meaning. It tends to lead to kind of another one of Ricoeur's great lines, as he says, beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again. It can lead to kind of a dry place where there is not much meaning, and that's where many of our young people find themselves today. So beyond that critical thinking, there comes a recognition that, well, you know what? Even when I understand these things in a rigorous kind of way, I recognize there is sort of an excess of meaning in these religious traditions, in these wisdom traditions. There's something here that a positivist philosophy or outlook cannot adequately explain. And so that comes with a certain humility and a willingness to sort of enter into those sort of mysterious regions of our human experience, while not rejecting or shutting down those critical capacities either. So a lot more to be said about that, but that's kind of my best stab for right now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick. It's a great response and lots of good conversations to come from this. I just want to thank you. This was terrific. And thank you, Todd. Thank you, Tony, who's not here, but I'm thankful to him for doing the introduction. And I really appreciate the good turnout we had tonight. I mean, this is a busy time of year, but it just shows how interested people are in this subject. So we're just that makes me really happy, and it makes me again grateful to you, Patrick, for having written the book. So thank you, everybody. We have another one coming up in 2 weeks, and that's going to be Justin Anderson, and well, you'll be getting notifications about that. So have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you.
Bye, Lillian.
Hey,
Bye, everybody.
Hi, buddy.
stay well. Stay well.
Bye.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Thank you, Todd.
Bye, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Hey, so Pat, when are you going to invite your librarian to one of your classes?
Which one do you want to come to? I'm not actually teaching in the core this year, unfortunately.
Oh, how sucky. Well, usually I've been telling Todd for years I'd like to sit in on some of his classes, but it never works because I'm always too busy and they're never at the right time. And one of the great things, the very few good things about this whole remote, what was that wonderful word that Tony called it? I wrote it down, the disincarnate environment or something. Yeah. Is you can actually kind of go to more things. Like right now, I'm on reference. I could never attend a talk at this time of day when I'm on reference, but apart jump off and answer things. Anyway, I should let you go. It's probably dinner time. Take care. Great talk.
Thanks for coming, Lisa.
Books on order.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yep, there it is.